Welcome to the Bicarian Podcast. I'm Erik.
And I'm Isla. This week's episode is Up in Smoke.
Up in Smoke. So, we actually started this conversation a little bit before we started recording, and it's really interesting because this one bounces around quite a bit.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of key we stick to our key points to kind of make it through because there's a lot to cover.
Thank you for that direction, Erik. I appreciate it. We'll see how well I do.
Oh yeah, no, we'll get off track. I'm right there with you every time we do. But I do find that in this case, to kind of make all the points, you really laid it out really well in the notes. So,
well, thank you. Well, when we were doing our episode a few weeks ago on sex workers and the tech industry, you brought up the point that seemed to be following the same route as the drug war and suggested that we look into that. So I started looking into it, and it's a real rabbit hole, let me tell you.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I think everybody kind of realizes that anytime this subject comes up with anyone I've ever talked to, it gets deep. And generally people that I've called friends all acknowledge that like the war on drugs has been a waste. Doesn't always work out. Criminalizing things has always made it hard, but even I'm sort of surprised in a good way at how like the legalization of pot has actually influenced things in Colorado where we live and in the other states that have done it. So it's been an intriguing topic for me for a while.
Yeah, and my guess is that we'll have more to sort of look into. This is a first brush attempt, and we'll see where we land. So a couple of the things that I wanted to start with were just some of the basic things about how the U.S. government works. I'm going to assume that people have some small interest in that.
Yeah, I don't think everybody always gets how we've ended up where we're at and why things are a thing. For example, point one that you have written down here, states' rights. It's funny because most people don't even realize the Civil War was not about slavery. It was about states' rights. The states that ceded from the Union were saying, we as states have the right to do things the way we want. We're not telling you you have to keep slavery. We're saying that we want to. It was a battle, literally, and a war that was started over the concept of states' rights.
Right. And they lost, and so that's actually the beginning of the tyranny of the federal government, as I believe would have been said by the people of that time and some people today. And it's a constant question that we're engaging in, like how important is it that we have a unified federal overview of things,
right,
versus allowing each of the states to govern as they see fit within their borders.
Yeah. And it's what it's become is that federal law trumps any state law. So a state can have any laws that it wants to, but a federal law would always basically counteract any kind of state law. And it's put a lot of interesting situations that have happened. Gay marriage was obviously a big deal because states were not going against the federal law. There was no federal law until, and there still isn't a federal law. Precedent was set in the Supreme Court.
Correct.
That made it so that
it
basically
struck down what they called the Defense of Marriage Act.
Exactly. So once the precedent was set, which is an interesting whole other topic to talk about, how many of our what we consider to be laws are not actually on the books as laws. They're just Supreme Court precedent.
Right. And then the other part of that is the full faith and credit portion of the Constitution.
Right.
Which is that when you make a legal agreement in one state, it is supposed to be honored in another state. And that's what they ran into with marriage that included same-sex people.
Right.
However, there's that also, if I have medical marijuana, I can still be arrested if I go to a state where it's not legally respected. However, there's some question around that. So it's a really, in that way, it's an interesting question. And then Sessions recently, the beginning of the year, canceled the Obama era memos,
Yes.
which said they weren't going to prosecute.
They had basically agreed to respect the state's rights on this without any sort of legal precedent or law saying that they, had to for any reason. During the Obama administration, he was literally quoted as directing the federal prosecutors to not focus on any kind of prosecution of that.
Well, and this is what's interesting. I looked it up. The memo was they wanted to focus on areas of enforcement rather than individuals. So it's not that he said don't enforce the law.
Right.
However, the aims were to prevent distribution of marijuana to minors, stop the growing of marijuana on public land, keep pot from falling in the hands of cartels and gangs, and prevent the diversion of marijuana to states where it remains illegal. So those were the areas of enforcement that he wanted to focus on rather than prosecuting individuals. So it wasn't that he said, "Oh, it's fine, everybody smoke up."
Yeah.
Right? He just said, "Let's stop this silliness."
Absolutely. And interestingly enough, that was the point that I made in the episode on sex workers that we had done.
Yeah.
Was that by legalizing it in these states, they've really disempowered the cartels. So in some ways, the enforcement that he was asking for in those memos was kind of a default response. The cartels stopped worrying about pot when there was no money to be made in it because it was legal to grow and sell in those states. Now, I don't even know for sure. They're probably operating fairly well in Texas. One thing I have learned about Texas is we don't get a lot of news down there.
I know nothing about that.
So it's really interesting because I used to travel to Laredo at a previous job. And I'd go down there and you'd hear these stories about what ICE was up to, what DEA was up to in the town of Laredo. It never made CNN. It barely made it out of the state of Texas.
Yeah.
Like it was a full-on disaster down there when you're down there around it. And most people outside of the state of Texas or even in that area did not realize how bad things were. So it was very eye-opening that just, what we get fed in the media is not always accurate.
Yeah, we don't get a lot of information, which is kind of interesting.
But I can tell you that the crimes that were going on down there before the legalization of pot in all of the states where it's now legal recreationally were almost entirely based around specifically marijuana trafficking over the border.
Huh. Well, so in researching this topic, I have to say there is a lot more like propaganda and politicized information than there is anything that seems that you can really kind of sink your teeth into. There's a lot of people with strong opinions and not a ton of what seems to be like consistently substantiated facts. So, and I always want to put out there the caveat, not investigative journalists or anything. We're sort of trying to come at these things from a reasonable people trying to figure this out.
Yeah.
So just to say, I'm sure there are people out there who are investigative journalists who can get at better facts. However, if you're a person looking at stuff, just trying to get some sense of what's going on, mostly what you're going to find is a lot of propaganda.
Yeah. It's very politicized. And the studies that I've seen on this all seem to have a slant. They're trying to prove a point.
Yeah, whatever point it is. Sometimes it's a point I like.
90% of statistics can be made to say anything, quote, it's a dumb quote, but it's absolutely true.
Right.
Like you can spin the stats from a lot of things to say different things.
Yeah.
So one of the key things for me in all of this is to try to look at some real life examples and not necessarily studies because, it's rough. It is. When you said that, I was sad but not surprised that, finding some real honest studies that didn't have a political slant or weren't connecting flagrant fallacies of logic that, A plus B suddenly equals X. There's no, wow, that's a jump, right? These just fallacies that people have been propagating over subjects like this for political reasons.
Well, and I was doing my research and I thought, I should probably be incognito or something while I do this because
right.
I'm bouncing from like the Rocky Mountain High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Program, which is the federal White House enforcement for these like 4 states on drug trafficking, to the like We Love Cannabis, How to Avoid a Drug Test site to try and understand some things about how marijuana gets processed. And I'm just like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
This can't be good.
I'm sure I'm sure you're flagged for something.
My cookies are just, I don't even know. But that was part of what got me was, I was looking at this report by HIDTA. It's a 180-page study on the impact of the legalization of marijuana. And on the I didn't read all 180 pages. I maybe read like the first 40.
And I got it through telephone because you told me about it already. So why don't you tell our listeners about it?
Well, and so I just wanted to give you an example of sort of this interesting propaganda piece, which is that on the surface of it, it looks really, really well done. And they're like, this is what proponents of legalization said, and this is what people who are against it say, and this is our report, and you should let the facts stand for themselves, right? And I'm like, oh, yeah, I love that, right? Like, that totally speaks to my, innate desire for all research to be helpful. And then I'm looking at their charts, and I'm reading this, and I'm like, they don't account for a couple of things. For example, they say that and they do a pretty good job of saying, okay, like there's 3 sort of eras in pot usage in Colorado. There's the original legalization for medical, which very much, like almost none of it, no one did it from like 2001 to 2008.
Right.
And then there was the next level of legalization, which came about because a judge said they had to allow dispensaries to occur. Before that, they didn't allow that. And that was 2008 to 2013. And then 2013 is when it was recreationally legalized. So they actually compare those 3 different time periods and how these different things occurred that they considered to be concerns, like crime rates and the hospitalizations or driving under the influence, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And
so, for example, one of the things they had was that there was a 60% increase in what they called marijuana-related fatalities, right? Okay, that sounds like a big deal.
Right.
Right? However, and they're very upfront about it. They're like, a marijuana-related incident is any incident in which somebody's toxicology report showed marijuana in their bloodstream.
Got it.
Okay? Marijuana can stay in your bloodstream anywhere from 6 hours to 7 days.
This is true.
So really all that I can see that they're showing is that more people who were in fatalities had marijuana in their bloodstream. It's now legal. I can imagine there's a lot of people who don't do things because it's not legal. So they're showing definitely more people are using marijuana.
Yep.
That's really the only thing I think you can conclude from that particular number. However, it looks pretty intense. You're like, oh my gosh, 62% more fatalities. This is horrible.
Right.
And so I was reading through it and kind of noting, and they don't ever point that out, that that toxicology exists. So, and that they have to know. I mean, I found it I was like, wait a minute.
Scientifically, we're talking correlation versus causality here.
Right.
And so scientifically, any kind of a report like that or scientific study has to take into account the causality versus the correlation.
Right. Well, and I found another article that was done in 2012 where they did an actual study on stoned driving. And they said that if you drive within the first 3 hours of getting stoned, that you are twice as likely to get into a fatal accident or an accident. So they have done that. Definitely much more likely. However, the challenge with, and it's a challenge of marijuana in general, is that because it stays in the bloodstream so much longer, there's a difficulty pinpointing. All they can say is that the people who are in these fatalities had it in their bloodstream. They don't know when they smoked.
Right.
So, there's just no.
I'm always a fan of allegory, and to me, this study reminds me of a study that came out several years ago now that pointed out that like 90% of women with bladder cancer dyed their hair. And the 90 I'm making up, but it was a very high number. It might have even been like 100%. It was just like a ridiculous number. And the reality is most women dye their hair at some point. And there's no reason to believe that that correlated or caused bladder cancer.
Right.
But the report presented it in that way. And I feel like that when we mentioned the politicization of these kinds of reports, they make these bold statements without taking into account that. And so you almost automatically, I mean, that's a 180-page report that's pretty much useless because you can't really gauge anything based on that. Because yes, marijuana became legal in varying stages. More people had it in their system. The same number of people were probably in fatal car accidents.
Actually, that is true. With the number of people, that was part of it. Was I was looking at the number of fatal car accidents.
How did I guess?
It was pretty close, and the dip in fatal car accidents occurred in like 2008, 2009, when it went from being no dispensaries to dispensaries.
Yeah,
that's when it went from like 515 down to like 440 or something per year. Now it's back up to like 540.
right.
However, exactly that. That's
the
what
only thing that report proves based on those numbers is that more people were smoking pot.
More people have been smoking, and I think
it wasn't causing more fatal car accidents.
As far as we can tell, there's not a significant difference in that. But it was interesting to look at that and to realize like, oh, I kind of knew I couldn't necessarily trust like the activist reports or the people that were like super judgy. However, I thought, well, maybe this is a, it looks like they tried to be pretty on the up and up. So I'll go through and I'm like, oh, I'm not saying that everything in there is useless. I just was like, oh, that they are leaving out some key points that are kind of inform whether or not this is valid. So then my next question was, all right, well, why do we care? I mean, that's always my question. Like, why do we care if people are using pot at all or drug? I mean,
most people make the argument that it's no different than alcohol.
Right.
It's a different feeling, a different effect, but ultimately no more or less dangerous than alcohol. And it is funny because we had a private conversation about this earlier. We brought up one simple fact that some of the most accurate data you could ever pull can actually back up that argument. Fine, pot's no different than alcohol. We've got over, almost 100 years since Prohibition ended of information about a free and accessible drug that is considered to be somewhat addictive, that is considered to reduce inhibitions and cause interesting, if not bad, situations. It's certainly possible and capable of bringing out the worst in people. We have the data.
So is bad television. I mean, like, I don't know.
That's true. But my point here is that,
football brings out the worst in people.
It does make people angry.
Have you seen those? I've seen those post-game riots. I'm just saying. Nobody wants to make football illegal.
Nobody's looking at you, Philadelphia.
Well, okay. Maybe there. I'm just saying, like.
They greased the poles to keep people from climbing them.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't work.
Well, there you go. See?
But, I find it interesting because we have, all of the arguments about addiction, all of the arguments about it increasing violent behavior or decreasing violent behavior, all of that stuff. Let's go off of the argument that a lot of people make. Oh, it's no different than alcohol. Great. We've got a lot of data on alcohol. And a couple of key things about alcohol that I have always held to be true based on personal experience as well as what I, have seen in various different, reports and this and that. Alcohol is addictive, but not everybody who drinks becomes addicted.
Well, and I'm not going to interrupt you except to say put a pin in that because I did some really interesting research on this concept of addiction.
Well, all right, let's go to addiction because I think the main thing that we've always heard about, like the primary bad thing about drugs, all drugs,
leads to crime, and you're going to get addicted, and you're going to be ruined.
Exactly.
Right.
So maybe we can take the rest of our time on the show and kind of talk about addiction and some of the myths and fallacies of that, because I happen to know you did some research on that.
Oh my gosh, I did. Well, it was really interesting, actually. I'm going to put a link to this, and I think reading this is totally worth your time because one of the original researchers who his research led to the we're going to date ourselves now. The ad with the fried egg, your brain on drugs.
This is your brain on drugs.
Uh-huh. So that research was, let's see, I have to read just a little bit of what they did. So they used to use this thing called a Skinner box, where they would put rats in it and study them for psychological responses to a bunch of things. And the little rat would press a lever and get rewarded or punished. Reward would usually be food. And punishment would be an electric shock on the floor. Because that's okay. And so they thought using the Skinner box would be a great place to study drug addiction. So they allowed the rats to inject small doses of a drug into themselves by pressing a lever. This required tethering the rat to the ceiling of the box with tubing and surgically implanting a needle or a catheter into their jugular veins. The drug passed through the tube and the needle into the rat's bloodstream almost instantaneously when they pushed the lever. It reached their brains moments later. Under appropriate conditions, rats would press the lever often enough to consume large amounts of heroin, morphine, amphetamine, cocaine, and other drugs. The mass media of the day were quite excited about these experiments. The results seemed to prove that drugs were irresistibly addicting, even to rodents and by extension to human beings. The conclusion that illegal drugs are irresistibly addicting fit well with the fearsome images that were being propagated about them. The rat research provided additional support for the war on drugs. Irresistibly addicting drugs certainly cannot be allowed to circulate in human society, especially if we are, as we are told, this is your brain on drugs. But I can tell you, if I had a needle in my bloodstream and I'm tethered to the wall of a cage, and the only way I can ever feel good ever is to press a lever to get a drug, I think I would do that.
I fully agree. It's amazing how some of these studies, under what nobody would consider a realistic condition, are just taken as the new gospel. And it becomes a pervasive part of culture.
Yeah.
That we're just fed, all this stuff's addictive. Now, caveat. Some of the drugs that you listed are known to be chemically addictive.
Yes.
Scientifically. Like, this is a brain receptor thing. And you and I were talking about this, and now you're gonna counteract. But let me just explain the science behind it is that your brain builds receptors for certain drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And those receptors then become more active. And so you can have a physical withdrawal. This is the nicotine effect. Again, a completely legal and highly addictive drug.
So here's the thing. It's not that I'm in any way attempting to say that addiction doesn't occur or that it's not physiological as well as psychological. However, even people who have physiological addictions, if they have psychological support systems, are much less likely to continue with the addiction. And what they found was that, for instance, with the rats, I feel so bad for these rats. And I actually hate rats. And I'm looking at these pictures of these rats and I'm super phobic. And I was feeling so bad for them because they were really treated quite badly. And what he was saying was that these same guys who did that original experiment did another one where they put the rats in what they call rat park, give them everything a rat could want. Socialization, like little fun things to do, good food, even some sweetened water.
Let's clarify this. A rat in a cage sounds pretty horrible, but let's talk about rats for a second. They're social creatures.
Yes.
So they're already isolated. So they're tapping a button to get drugs, but not only are they in a miserable situation in a cage, but their basic animal need, much like a basic human need of like social interaction stuff, are completely off the table.
Yeah, they had nothing.
So that's why this park thing is kind of intriguing, because suddenly they were given a much more pleasant society to live in.
They were given everything a rat could want. They were given mental and emotional connection and stimulation, the social structure, food. They were not tied to a cage with a catheter.
The little things.
The little things in life, right? And what happened was their drug use decreased was almost non-existent. And so what the researchers came to, as I said, it became absolutely clear to us that the earlier Skinner box experiments did not prove that morphine was irresistible to rats. Rather, most of the consumption of rats isolated in a Skinner box was likely to be a response to isolation itself. So they published the results of their experiments, which didn't get nearly as much attention as the ones that led to the fried egg thing.
It's almost like society wanted to have confirmation bias on that subject.
Yeah. I mean, there's something about it that's, I guess,
The
scary
Skinner
to people.
box was in the 60s, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
the original tests.
The original tests were in the
There
60s.
was a counterculture going on of
Mm-hmm.
free love and free drugs. And I feel like society as a whole was reacting to that. People wanted to hear that, oh, see, we knew this was bad.
Yeah. And he talks about like the view of addiction from Rat Park is that today's flood of addiction is occurring because of our hyper-individualistic, hyper-competitive, frantic, crisis-ridden society, which makes most people feel social and culturally isolated. Chronic isolation causes people to look for relief. They find temporary relief in addiction to drugs or any 1,000 other habits and pursuits because addiction allows them to escape from their feelings, deaden their senses, and experience an addictive lifestyle as a substitute for a full life.
Since I know you're going to listen to this later, I'm just going to put in a note that this is a future show topic.
Addiction?
How social media is actually isolating and not connective. Because I think that it is true. But you know what? That's an interesting topic. But the addiction, the social isolation that's happened, I mean, we didn't have social media in the 80s and most of the 90s.
No.
And people still got addicted. So some of it is just societal without need of cell phones and computers and Facebook as a cause of that isolation.
Yeah, no, people find, I mean, he talks about invisible cages that we're fragmented. There's another book called Runaway World by Anthony Giddens, where he kind of talks about how globalization there's some really great benefits. It's kind of shrunk the world in a bunch of different ways. However, as we've globalized, we've lost a lot of our traditional sources of connection and community. So most of us don't gather once a week at church, and we don't really talk to our neighbors a lot. And so that is a form of isolation that a lot of people are actually proud of, right? Like, oh, I don't really need people or whatever. However, that isolation is actually quite harmful and could be a contributing factor to this addiction issue. But the other thing that's really interesting to me is that, so if we follow my logic here, like I feel a little isolated and I want to take relief. If I take relief in becoming, obsessed with work, that's okay. If I take it by drinking, as long as I can hide it, that's probably fine.
Assuming it actually meets what the scientific definition of a drinking problem is. Does it affect your daily life? Do you black out?
Right.
There's a list.
There's a list. But if I take that in some form of drug, then it's dangerous. And some of the research that I was reading was saying that this idea of addiction being a brain disease, that the people who buy into that idea that they have a disease are actually less likely to recover than the people who see addiction as a result of their circumstance. And not to say that, like, it's tricky, right? Because I don't want to come across as saying, oh, if you're addicted, like, it's your fault in some way, like in that sort of judgy kind of thing. However, it's more saying that people have a lot more ability to affect their circumstances than they do to affect a brain disease.
So I have very empirical experience of that.
Okay.
Because my stepdad was an alcoholic for my entire life and always called it a disease and never recovered from it.
Yeah.
He was a victim of a disease. He'd never took personal responsibility. So I watched that exact behavior for most of my life.
And it's pain. And it's not the thing is that, like, if you feel isolated, let's say that, there's research that talks about how, like, social and cultural isolation is the largest consideration. If you feel isolated and you don't know how to fix it, you don't know how to connect, that is an overwhelming thing to deal with. So you don't want to blame someone because they feel isolated. That's just going to make it worse. And that's my point, right? Like I seek relief for my feeling of isolation in something. And then I know that that makes me really bad and unwantable. So I seek more relief in that thing that makes me feel more isolated. So it's a very self-perpetuating situation. And that's where like I think the recovery process and the ways in which people really seek to bring people in can have some real benefit for folks. So I'm not saying it's not good. However, I found this other thing that was really interesting. In 2007, they did a study on addiction, and they basically concluded that research found that even heroin addicts can and often do recover without assistance. This can be seen in studies of Vietnam vets. Half of vets used opium or heroin at least once. 20% became physically addicted or dependent, but only 1% stayed addicted long term, even though most of them didn't receive any kind of treatment.
Interesting.
So, like what you were talking about, like the chemical addiction, it does occur. However, it seems like with Vietnam vets and rats, because they've actually got this information, that the physical addiction isn't enough without the supporting social and cultural isolation.
Right.
So and then they did this other one that was really interesting, that stressed out brains tend to remember rewards better than punishments or bad consequences.
Oh, I'm sure.
So
the rewards probably stick out like a sore thumb, compared, when stress is involved. Whereas if you're less stressed, that reward mentality is probably less significant.
Right. So if I'm stressed out and I really want a cookie, I'm going to forget, quote unquote, that cookie's off my diet, and I'm eat the cookie. Whereas when I'm not stressed out and I have a little bit more, equanimity going on, I'm like, oh, a cookie sounds good and it will taste good, but there's just the consequence that I don't want. I'm more able to incorporate that into my thinking.
Right.
So I found that treatment programs that give small rewards like merchandise or movie vouchers for clean urine samples work significantly better than punitive treatments, and they actually save money. But programs that use positive reinforcement have traditionally been controversial because they're seen as rewarding addicts, a concept which many critics disagree, even though it's more successful. So that's the thing for me about like kind of the war on drugs is, or the decriminalization aspect of it, is if addiction is one of the big reasons we think it's bad, and the crimes that go with addiction, you have to have your drugs, so you're going to do crime. And that's kind of how they talk about it. And the reality is that our brains work from a place of remembering reward over punishment. So laws and harsh punishments aren't actually going to stop people. And social and cultural isolation is a large part of why people become addicts. Then criminalizing it and punishing people is actually a great way to ensure that we have more addicts and more crime, as far as I can tell.
I would tend to agree.
So
I don't really have anything to back up that, but it feels like that's probably the case. And I'm not surprised that these studies somewhat can confirm that. And I think this kind of sets up where we can take this topic further in the future. I would like to see what sorts of, if any, addictive behavior have come from the legalization of pot. I'm curious if behaviors around it have changed because it's legal.
I think people are definitely using it more. Like, I mean,
people are using it more. That's a fact. I mean, we know that based on the number of people who happened to crash their car that smoked pot in the last week.
Oh my God, so funny.
But I mean, it's kind of a legit thing.
It is.
Because now we actually get to study. Like I said, we've got 100 years of the capability of studying the effects of alcohol. It has not ruined society. It has ruined lives. People can be addicted to it. They can do really terrible things on it. But not everybody who's had a drink in the last week has done that automatically. Nor has everyone who's had a drink, for the last 5 days in a row become addicted. So I think it's highly personal, but there's bound to be statistics, hopefully non-politicized statistics soon, that will cover sort of what the real world aspects of the legalization of pot have caused.
Well, your point is good in that with the alcohol one, I found one that I thought was interesting. I'm not going to read it, but they were talking about, I was reading up on, some different websites. And because it's so politicized, I had to read lots of slanted websites to try and find some aspect of something consistent. And it's something you were saying earlier before we started recording, which is that what they'll do is they'll say things like 80% of people who commit violent crimes have been drinking. And what doesn't occur is how many people in general were drinking that night that no crimes were committed,
Right.
because in some ways you can't really prove a negative or whatever. But if they were to say, it's like the gun thing, there's 134 mass shootings and there's some many million gun owners.
Right.
And it's, yes, 80% of the people who did these things were drinking. And how many people overall what percentage of the people who were drinking did those things is the other question that doesn't get asked.
Right.
And so that's where it gets politicized.
Right. Yeah, it's all very interesting. I'm sure we can dive into this further. I would really like to see what kind of research we can do and find some more of these kinds of maybe non-politicized studies to dig into further.
Since we went a little long, we're going to skip our bi-Curian moments this week. We hope to hear from you. If you have ideas, feedback, thoughts, please find us on social media, bi-Curian on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, or give us a call. We have a message line now, 720-507-7309, or email podcast@bicurian.com. Let us know what you're thinking.
And thanks for listening this week.